What is up, guys? Today I'm gonna show you a really cool game between the youngest Grandmaster ever versus the best GM ever. Playing white is Abhimanyu Mishra, who got the United States Chess Federation rating of 2000 only at the age of 7, later became the Grandmaster at the age of 12, earlier than anyone else, including Magnus Carlsen, who got the title at 13. Carlsen is playing black, and initially it's all standard stuff. Mishra is going for the Catalan Opening. By the way, Carlsen loves playing it as white, but this time he has to deal with it, playing himself as black. And bishop b4 check, and the bishop returns back to d6. Very interesting game, because in this game, white actually tried to attack black as hard as he could, and it's interesting to see what could Carlsen do against that. Now, the one question you may have about this situation particularly is, why would black play this in between check bishop b4 only to return the bishop to d6? Why not to put the bishop to d6 straight away? Well, these are all kinds of the GM tricky stuff. Now, the bishop on d2, which was provoked by this in between check bishop b4, is not particularly helpful, and it still controls the same diagonal as it used to on c1, but standing on d2, it possibly blocks the queen, and the queen no longer controls the center. So that was the black point of giving this in between check to return back to d6. Anyway, white goes knight c3, knight c6, both sides develop. Another question you may have is, can't white just push this pawn forward and chase this bishop away? Well, he can, but he didn't. The thing is, if white does that, yes, indeed, they push the bishop back. However, the downside of the move is that they no longer attack the center. They no longer put pressure, which makes the black life easier. And black can play b6 later on, trade off this active pawn, completely destroying the white center, which would be pretty cool for black. That's why Mishra did not go for this. Instead, he just played bishop g2, playing simple developing moves, and at this point Carlsen grabbed the pawn on c4. That's a pretty standard thing in the Catalan Opening. Black often grabs this pawn, and usually white is able to get it back just because this pawn of black is standing too far away from the rest of their army, which is mostly on the final ranks. Therefore, it's relatively easy for white usually to get this pawn back. However, white still has to waste some time doing so, and during this time black can finalize their development. Anyway, initially, white goes bishop g5, just trying to untangle their pieces so the queen still has more space to move around. Also, he's putting the pin to the knight, therefore Carlsen goes pawn h6, eliminating this pin. And after the exchange on f6, white goes rook c1. By the way, that's a really cool thing to remember. When you look at the games of GMs, you can realize that they never forget about that rook in the corner. They always try to bring it into play. While as a coach, I've seen a lot of games of my students, and unfortunately, it's quite common to see the game where one side lost or got in a totally losing position, while their rook was still in the corner doing nothing throughout the entire game. So just never forget about this. Talking about the current position, white probably wants to go knight e4, which is going to fork the queen and the bishop, and will also open up for the file for the rook to pick up this pawn on c4. Anticipating that move, Carlsen played queen e7, a prophylactic move so that if knight e4 comes, that does not hit the queen on f6. And therefore white instead rerouted the knight to b5. From here it still hits the bishop, and white wants to get back their pawn on c4. Now to this, Carlsen responded with bishop b4. Which is actually an interesting moment of the game, because what it tells me is that Carlsen is trying to play for a win. Because otherwise he could have played something much simpler, such as bishop to d7, and just enjoy an equal game. But bishop b4 aims to keep his pair of bishops. And generally, a bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight, and therefore saving the bishop is a good thing positionally. Now, of course, allowing this trade would not lead black to rooting their position. But anyway, white would accumulate those little positional advantage, and as your opponent accumulates more and more of those little positional advantages, over time it can lead to a big advantage. And Carlsen tries to avoid this by going bishop b4, and also he just complicates matters trying to play for a win. He clearly wants to beat this Prodigy and say that, hey, I'm the real Prodigy, I'm Magnus Carlsen. Carlsen, by the way, was very competitive. It's interesting that although nowadays he's considered one of the greatest chess geniuses of all times, initially when his father introduced chess to Magnus, Magnus did not show interest into chess. And later he said that he actually got excited about chess just because he wanted to beat his older sister, and that's when he started to study chess, really. So that's quite an interesting story. Anyway, white goes a3, attacking the bishop retreats, and now rook takes c4. Finally, white got their pawn back. And now actually black has a little bit of a hard time completing their development. So the rook is still underdeveloped. It's not easy to bring this bishop to an active square. This bishop on a5, although a nice piece in general, but right now is not doing much, and white can play b4 and shut it down, so black has a little bit of a hard time to figure out how to complete the development of the queen side, and therefore Carlsen just played rook d8, playing the move that is useful anyway, and postponing the question with these pieces for later. Now on d8, the rook is opposite to the queen, which could in some variations create certain tactical opportunities, maybe pawn e5, trying to put pressure, down the d file, something like that. But for the most part, it's just bringing the rook into play and also kind of an awaiting move. And now, white played something very interesting. Now, you could easily anticipate white playing any simple move. For instance, he could see that there is some pressure down here and just play pawn e3 with a very solid and good position for white. However, the kid did not hesitate to start a massive attack against Carlsen, and he played rook takes c6, a very interesting, highly creative move. That sacrifices the rook against the knight, initially for seemingly no reason. However, white is not retreating right now, he's playing knight e5, and that was the point of his combo. That opens up the bishop to put pressure down this diagonal, as well as the knight from e5 is ready to jump to c6. Now, the first move that comes to mind for black here is just to grab this knight, but that actually turns out to be a bad mistake, and Carlsen did not play it. However, I'm sure most players would. So pawn takes b5 turns out to be wrong, and not due to bishop takes a8. That would just regain the material balance. It's much stronger for white to play knight to c6, which is a triple fork right here. And of course, first and foremost, black needs to save the queen, but after the queen moves somewhere, white can then grab the rook, which in turn opens up this discovered attack once again. Therefore, black needs to save the rook, but after that, the knight keeps horsing around knight c6, delivering yet another fork, and white actually wins material and the game, and that's the combo white was hoping for. In reality, Carlsen figured that out and played bishop d7 just to guard this pawn and also to complete his development. Now, white captures this pawn with a bishop, which is the correct move. Taking it with a knight would actually end white's attack, because after this trade, there's just a one-move attack, but black can easily escape from it, and after that, black's got a rook against a knight, which is a material advantage for black, and that's not what white wants. Therefore, instead, white captures on c6 with a bishop, and the battle goes on, and black is still having a hard time figuring out what to do, because white still delivers this double attack to the bishop and the rook. Black needs to do something, and once again, the most natural move is actually not the best move. If black were to take here on c6, which Carlsen didn't, after knight takes c6, black again has to face this triple fork to his pieces, and white's position is pretty cool. These knights are, generally speaking, doing a great job attacking so much in the black's territory, making it hard for black to move around. Like this knight takes away this square, for instance, and is just very uncomfortable. Therefore, Carlsen thought about this and played another simple move, bishop to e8. Now, it's interesting that when you look at games of Carlsen and Fischer back in the day, there was this seemingly simple attitude that they choose. Like, their opponents calculate a lot of variations, comes up with those creative sacrifices, and they play seemingly simple chess, but somehow it works. Like, it's not easy to explain that, but that's that simplicity of a genius, where he plays great moves, although they make it look simple. Anyway, after bishop to e8, white grabbed this rook in the corner, black recaptured. And at the end of the day, white actually won this pawn, which used to be right here on b7. However, black saved two bishops, which is also cool. There is also this idea that positional players prefer having bishops and tactical players prefer having knights. And in this case, you can see that Carlsen, being a great positional player, really made sure that he's got his both bishops alive. And white, on the other hand, coming up with all these combos, made sure that he's got the knights in place. And indeed, there were a number of forks that he used or could use in all these variations. Anyway, right now white is up a pawn, but he still has certain issues, and the first one is this knight is being attacked. Therefore, Mishra just retreated it back. And now there was another interesting moment. Carlsen played pawn to c5, which certainly makes perfect sense. He wants to contest the center and get rid of his isolated pawn on c7. However, what questions me is that I'm pretty sure that most strong players in this position would probably go for a much simpler idea. Just trade it on c3, because after that, on the next move, black can pick up this pawn on a3 and just regain material balance, and it feels good for white. I'm sorry, for black. I mean, white is also okay, but he still needs to be careful. Maybe white should play something like queen e1, and perhaps the position is about equal. I guess that Carlsen was still trying to play for a win, and that is how he did not went for this line, which is interesting because objectively probably like should have went for it. Anyway, he played c5, keeping the position more interesting. Now he's putting pressure here, and white played pawn d5. And once again, white, facing the greatest player ever, we can see that he does not shy away from playing aggressive attacking moves, trying to put pressure. He is not trying to just simplify matters. d5 puts pressure on black. Now this pawn is ready either to take or to go forward. And Carlsen played rook d8. Another interesting thing about strong players is that they do not take, because they watched all my videos and they know that to take is a mistake. But seriously, they just understand that keeping up the pressure is usually the strongest thing that you can do, while if you release the pressure and you just take, you let your opponent's pieces to come forward and attack you, and you make their life better. Like normally white would love to capture this pawn with a knight, but that would drop the knight right here on e5. Therefore white would instead play queen takes d5, also hitting this rook in the corner. And after rook d8, at first feels like white is a little bit in trouble, somehow their pieces are hanging, but white calculated yet another counter blow with their knight, and that is the move knight to c6, which is a pretty nice counter, countering this queen on e7, which would come with a check to the king. Therefore black has to trade on c6, and now at the end of the day white is up a pawn. Black is more active, but nevertheless black needs to fight for equality, and Carlsen did not went for it. So let's take it back. Instead of all that, Carlsen played rook d8, just maintaining the pressure, putting the rook to an open position, beating this pawn, and he keeps counterattacking. White goes knight c4, he realizes that the central construction is a little bit shaky, he wants to get rid of it. Knight c4 attacks the bishop, like takes right here on c3, and what would everyone does? Well, they would recapture right here on c3, which would be a bad move to play, because after that, black can actually take this pawn on d5, attack the knight, and overall, like, black's setup is very strong, and now white needs to defend. The knight has to go somewhere back, and it doesn't look good for white. In the game, however, white found another nice tactical move, pawn d6, which is an in-between move, also known as Zwischenzug, I think it's called that way in German. Looks like Germans love those fancy techniques, because the two techniques in chess, Zugzwang and Zwischenzug, probably I mispronounced it once again, are somewhat unusual and interesting things. Anyway, white goes d6, hitting the queen. Carlsen goes queen b7. This time white recaptures the bishop on c3, and at first looks like white just got this passed pawn on d6, and he's still up a pawn. However, Carlsen just plays queen a6, taking aim at many weaknesses at once, and it turns out that white cannot maintain his advantage. The knight has to go, but once that happens, and white played knight e5, now black can finally get rid of this extra pawn and also hit the queen. And Carlsen starts to little by little to take over. Now white needs to be careful because the queen is attacked. This queen from a6 hits the pawn on a3, and also it keeps an eye on this pawn on e2. Therefore white really needs to be very careful, balancing and trying to find not to go down. And he played the move queen c2, which seems to be an inferior move. It was better for white to go queen b3, trying to go inside and creating some sort of a counterattack. He instead played queen c2, which also looks like a decent move. It keeps guarding this pawn, and he was hoping for Carlsen to grab this juicy pawn on a3. And by the way, let this be our quick puzzle of the day. Please let me know in comments below, is queen a3 a good move for black or not? What do you think about that? In the game, Carlsen also played an in-between move, pawn f6, kicking this knight back, and only after that he grabbed this pawn on a3, and now Carlsen is up a pawn. White goes rook b1. He still seeks to get some counterplay after rook b8, beating the bishop and attacking on the last rank. And what do you do when you're up material? You want to simplify, and Carlsen goes queen a4. He wants to just trade off some material, making sure that white does not have any strong counterattack against him. And it's not easy for white to avoid this trade of queens, because there aren't that many squares where the queen could go to, first of all. Also, if it goes somewhere to b2, black could go either rook d1 and force the exchange of rooks, or maybe rook b6 and still keep chasing the pieces and forcing some exchanges. Therefore, it was not easy for white to escape those trades, and he actually accepted the trade on a4. Now it goes rook to b8, check. Carlsen goes king to f7. Actually, not many players know that in an endgame, your king becomes an active piece, and it is approximately as strong as a knight. And therefore you want to centralize your king just like you want to centralize your knight. Now after king to f7, the king from here hopes to guard some pawns, and possibly down the road black can keep centralizing the king, but of course it's not that easy to do it right away because white has all kinds of checks right here. White initially played rook a8, hitting this pawn. Carlsen goes a6 to guard it. Rook a7, white is still seeking counterplay, has to go back, and now I'd realize that their knight has nowhere to go because all these squares where white would wish to move normally are already taken by black. That's another interesting thing about Carlsen's games. Somehow he is a great positional player, and he puts his pawns and pieces to such positions where they always restrict his opponent, and therefore his opponent has a hard time moving forward and creating some attacks. White tried to reroute the knight somewhere else. He goes knight e1, possibly hoping to go knight d3, hitting the pawn, but Carlsen shuts that down once again, this time with this pin. White has to play king f1 and now bishop b5. Guarding this pawn and also putting the pressure down this diagonal. White played rook c7, hitting the pawn, therefore c4. It's unfortunate for black that they had to make their bishop to be a tall pawn, but at least they saved their both pawns, and white is still pinned, and for white is also not easy to do much. White played pawn f3, trying to play the king forward and escape from this pin. However, now rook c1 hits this pawn on c3, king f2, rook takes, now Carlsen is up 2 pawns. Knight to g2, white is still trying to get some counterplay after knight to f4. And it's also interesting to see how Carlsen converts this thing. Because theoretically, we could say, oh, black is up 2 pawns, they're like passer pawns, you should just move them forward and win. But in reality, when you're playing such positions, what often happens is that somehow you feel that it's winning, but then your opponent starts to horse around, indeed moves the knight right here, then somewhere here, gets all this unpleasant counterplay against your king, your pawns, and then oftentimes somehow you spoil a good game. So therefore, winning a one game is not an easy task. And let's see how Carlsen does that. He initially goes rook c2. He wants to counterattack. And after knight f4, he plays pawn to c3. So Carlsen did not even try to counter some of these threats of white. He instead decided, you know what, I'm going to counterattack. And he opened up the file for his rook, and now together with the bishop, they hit the pawn on e2, which makes it impossible for white to move the knight off the f4 square, or else the pawn will be lost and black will attack. White played king to e1, trying to bring his king closer, chase this rook away, and then possibly grab the pawn on c3 with his rook. Black goes e5, and all of a sudden black is the one attacking. So he wants to push this knight away and grab the pawn. Still, knight h5, white also comes up with certain counter threats. He now wants to grab this pawn on g7, but now it's black to play, so he goes rook e2 check, king d1. And now, again, of course, black should be winning here. He's got a bunch of extra pawns. This pawn is quite advanced. However, it's still not completely easy because still white wants to grab this pawn with check, later maybe grab this one, and also has some sort of counterplay. And Carlsen once again uses the idea of simplifying matters. He goes pawn c2. He even gives up a pawn just to trade off rooks and get to a more easier position where he doesn't have to deal with any counterattacks of white. Moreover, here he played bishop e2. And another funny thing appeared here in the position that the knight on the ream is indeed deem. It can't go out, like all these squares are taken by black, and therefore bishop takes f3 not only would win a pawn, but would also hit the knight, and the knight may even be captured. So white had to play g4, but now bishop takes f3 hits the pawn. White tried to guard it, but then after bishop g2, white actually resigned. Black is already 3 pawns up, and he keeps attacking this one. If this one goes, he can return back and attack everything here, and clearly, you don't even have to be Carlsen to win a position like this. I'd say it was a very nice game by both players. Hereafter, we skip a few first opening moves and get to this more critical position early in the middle game, where Carlsen plays bishop b4, trying to complicate matters. And then he actually ends up being under serious pressure, where white came up with all these fancy tactical ideas and pretty strong pressure. It felt for a moment where black could be in trouble, but somehow Carlsen managed to shut it down by playing pretty simple defensive moves. But they only look simple. In reality, they are complex, and most players will probably go wrong here. And then somehow it seemed like white is up a pawn and should have no problems, but then his position was a little bit fragile, and over time, despite white keep coming up with all these kind of creative counter-attacking moves and various kinds of forks with his knights, Carlsen managed to get the pawn back and then transition to his favorite phase where he's attacking weaknesses, he's having positional advantages, and he's squeezing the win. And when it gets to that point, usually Carlsen is unstoppable, and he indeed slowly but surely won the game, which is a very common Carlsen stuff, right? Initially it seemed like his opponent was doing everything right, was attacking, but somehow, like slowly but surely, Carlsen took over. Anyway, very interesting game by both, and if you want to learn all these positional ideas, how to become a strong positional player yourself, I've got a free masterclass that you can access by clicking the link somewhere on the screen or down below the video in the description, where I show you several most important ideas about the positional play that if you implement, you will also play maybe not as good as Carlsen, but certainly better than most of your opponents.